Behind the heavy mahogany doors of Beacon Hill's grand mansions, a photographer's darkroom, uncovered horrors Boston's elite would have done anything to keep hidden. In 1887, Edgar Hartwell, a respected post-mortem photographer, thought he was preparing the usual portraits of the wealthy Peyton patriarch. But when the silver nitrate plates developed, what emerged was not a tribute to a grieving family, but evidence of one of Massachusetts's most cold-blooded murders. What should have been a final family keepsake instead revealed chilling secrets, faint bite marks on the corpse's nails, defensive wounds disguised by thick layers of funeral makeup, and worst of all, the unmistakable look of a man who recognized the very people responsible for his death. The Peyton fortune worth millions today had been built on betrayal and blood, and the family was determined that the photographer who uncovered the truth would never leave Boston alive. By the winter of 1887, the city was caught between tradition and progress. Coal smoke drifted through the cobblestone streets, while Beacon Hill stood as the glittering heart of New England aristocracy, its iron balconies and purple-tinted windows hiding scandals as old as the Republic. Edgar Hartwell had opened his Washington Street studio 3 years earlier, specializing in post-mortem portraits at a time when death was both ever-present and deeply ritualized. Families of wealth and influence relied on him not only for his technical mastery of the large-format camera and chemical processes, but for his ability to capture their most private moments with discretion. Hartwell, a methodical man in his early 40s, worked in a studio draped in velvet and arranged with scientific precision, every tray bottle and glass plate in perfect order. His craft mattered because the portraits he produced became treasured symbols of devotion, displayed in parlors and passed down for generations. His clients were the names that filled society columns and ruled state politics families who prized tradition and appearances above all else. He had photographed shipping magnates, banking matriarchs, and countless children lost to illness despite their parents' fortunes. Now, as Boston's harbor bustled with steamships and electric streetlights, slowly crept into the city, Hartwell's camera was about to capture something that no amount of money or influence could erase: the truth about the Peytons and the secret that turned a memorial into a fight for survival in the gaslit streets of Victorian Boston. Telegraph lines strung across Boston like a metallic web carried news and business at speeds the previous generation could hardly imagine. But beneath that glittering promise of progress, the older families of the city clung to their power with white-knuckled intensity. Marriage was a transaction, inheritance was open warfare, and reputation mattered more than truth. The new industrial millionaires might raise mansions twice as large and host parties twice as extravagant, but they could never buy the pedigree that came from generations of Boston blood. This divide between old money and new wealth bred constant rivalries and thinly veiled contempt, a tension the Peyton family embodied better than anyone. Cornelius Peyton had built his empire through a careful blend of cunning investments, strategic marriages, and business dealings that would have destroyed him if ever exposed. His textile mills chewed through immigrant labor under conditions that barely met the law, while his shipping lines grew fat on trade routes that skirted legality. By 1887, at 73, Peyton's fortune approached $40,000, an immense sum for the time, and his influence stretched into banks, railroads, and the city's most powerful law firms. Politicians sought his approval. Ministers praised his philanthropy, and rivals dreaded his ruthless efficiency. He had survived the crash of 1873 stronger than ever, and his reputation as a man who played to win was matched only by his family's unshakable social standing. His Beacon Hill mansion reflected that dominance in every corner. Italian marble staircases polished by hand, Viennese chandeliers scattering prisms of light across silk wallpaper, European masterworks lining the walls, and Persian rugs muffling footsteps on mahogany floors. A dozen servants kept the household running with military precision, from the Irish cook who had been with the family for decades to the German butler who ruled the staff like a general. On a gray February morning, the news came to Edgar Hartwell. A messenger boy tracked mud across the photographer's spotless studio floor as he handed over a folded telegram sealed in deep blue wax. The words inside were spare, but commanding Cornelius Peaton, deceased. Family requests immediate memorial photography. Highest compensation assured. Beacon Hill residence. Urgent. Hartwell knew the name at once. The Peatons were Boston royalty, their reach stretching from Beacon Street parlors to the Somerset Club. A commission from them promised not only income, but recognition among the city's most powerful. Hartwell packed his equipment with methodical care. His brass-fitted camera with its leather bellows, felt-wrapped glass plates, bottles of developer and fixer sealed with wax, and the portable lighting rig that let him transform any room into a studio. The trip to Beacon Hill carried him through bare-branched elm trees clawing at a colorless sky, past carriages clattering along cobblestones, and gas lamps standing sentinel in the damp morning air. The Peaton mansion loomed ahead, a fortress of wealth and secrecy, its tall windows reflecting the skeletal trees outside like a house already watching. The Peaton mansion rose 4 stories in dark brown stone, its granite base solid as the bedrock beneath Beacon Hill. Tall windows framed in white wood lined each floor, while scroll-worked iron railings guarded the steps leading to a heavy oak door, marked only by a brass plate and announcement of wealth made with quiet authority. Hartwell knocked his breath curling in the icy air, the sound echoing into the house. A moment later, the butler appeared, a thin man with silver-threaded hair and hands that trembled as he accepted Hartwell's coat. His accent was faintly German, softened by years of careful restraint. "Mr. Hartwell, I presume? I am Wilhelm Krauss." His voice was polite, but his posture betrayed strain. He spoke of the family's grief as he led the photographer inside, explaining that they waited in the morning room while Cornelius Peaton's body had been prepared upstairs. The house was heavy with shadow. Thick draperies strangled the light, while gas lamps painted shifting patterns across burgundy silk wallpaper. The air smelled of flowers and expensive cologne. But beneath it lingered something sharper, metallic, the unmistakable trace of a rushed embalming. Persian rugs muted the creak of polished floors as the men ascended a marble staircase, its mahogany banister glowing like a mirror. Krauss murmured practiced words of sympathy with the measured cadence of a man rehearsing lines. Hartwell noted the stiffness in his delivery, as though duty rather than sorrow guided him. The corridor above stretched long and solemn, lined with oil portraits of Peaton ancestors. Sea captains stared out from gilded frames, ladies in empire gowns held their composure, and stern patriots in revolutionary uniforms looked down with eyes that seemed to follow. It was a gallery of power and permanence, each generation building on the last, until Cornelius had risen to outmatch them all. The master bedroom was a shrine to that triumph. The 4-poster bed carved with maritime motifs stood draped in blue silk. On it lay Cornelius Peaton, dressed as if prepared for a final banquet. Black tailcoat, pearl-studded shirt, and the silk cravat tied in the Windsor knot that had been his signature in life. The embalmer had done his work well. The folded hands combed gray hair and waxen face conveyed the illusion of peace, yet Hartwell immediately sensed something wrong. The curtains were drawn too tightly, the lamps placed too carefully, and the air carried the sharp note of carbolic acid, a smell that suggested concealment more than preservation. The room itself looked staged, its furniture arranged not for mourning, but for a tableau. Krauss confirmed the suspicion, producing a slip of paper in Margaret Peaton's hand. The family had issued instructions. Each member wished to be photographed with Cornelius in carefully chosen poses, each portrait meant to proclaim a unique bond with the deceased. As if on cue, they began to file in. Hartwell had seen grief in many forms: wailing mothers, stone-faced widowers, children too young to understand. But the Pitons were different. Their sorrow looked rehearsed, their glances too quick, their composure brittle. Margaret herself entered last, a striking woman in her late 50s, her iron-gray hair pinned with tortoiseshell combs, her expression composed but unreadable. Margaret Piton was the first to pose. Her mourning dress, cut in the latest style and glittering with jet buttons and beadwork, spoke of wealth even in grief. Yet her hands trembled as she arranged herself beside the bed. "I want to be photographed," holding his hand, she instructed. Her voice was firm, but her eyes betrayed her darting toward her grown children as if to measure their reactions. "We were married 34 years. No one knew him better than I did." The session stretched deep into the afternoon. Each family member demanded their own arrangement, their own statement of closeness to the deceased. Hartwell worked in his usual deliberate rhythm, adjusting lamps, measuring exposures, coating glass plates with emulsion in his portable darkroom, and hurrying each negative into his chemical baths before the image could fade. His patience was tested by the family's insistence on multiple poses, but his professional discipline never wavered. Theodore, the eldest son, was first among the children. At 38, he bore his father's jaw, but not his authority. His frock coat had come from Savile Row, his vest gleamed with obsidian buttons, and his shoes shone like mirrors in the lamplight. Though Hartwell noticed dried mud clinging to their edges, a careless detail out of place in such a household. Theodore placed his hand firmly on Cornelius's shoulder, insisting I should be photographed like this. As his heir and partner, I was his right hand in all things. The gesture struck Hartwell less as grief than as a claim of inheritance. Frederick, the youngest, was a different creature altogether. Only 25, slight, restless, his fingers tapped against his thigh as if he could not bear the stillness required. Where his brother commanded, Frederick sought reassurance. "Father always said I was his favorite," he muttered, as he knelt awkwardly beside the bed. "I want that remembered." The request was unusual, even pitiable, a grown man casting himself in the posture of a child. The sharp glances his siblings exchanged made clear the claim was unwelcome. Constance, the daughter, was pale and thin, her dark hair framing a face worn by recent strain. Her gown hung loose on her frame, suggesting illness or grief, or perhaps both. Her request unsettled Hartwell most of all. She wished to place a white rose on her father's chest and leaned to kiss his forehead. "Daddy always called me his little princess," she whispered, her voice breaking with what sounded like real sorrow, though the words carried a faint bitterness when she added, "Even when I disappointed him with my choice of husband." One by one, the family paraded themselves before the lens. To Hartwell's eye, it was less a funeral than a theater. Their grief seemed rehearsed, their whispers sharp with tension, their poses crafted to secure their place in memory as much as in inheritance. And beneath it all, something about Cornelius Piton's body continued to trouble him. No amount of artful staging could disguise the feeling that the patriarch's repose was not entirely natural, that the truth of his death lay just beneath the surface, waiting for Hartwell's plates to reveal it. The funeral director had done his work with skill, but Hartwell noticed immediately that the makeup was unusually heavy, especially around Cornelius's hands and throat. The pose, while correct by the conventions of mourning portraiture, felt staged. The limbs seemed arranged not at rest. As Hartwell moved quietly between his equipment and the body fragments of conversation drifted toward him. Snatched whispers the family believed he was too distracted to hear. Margaret hissed to Theodore about changing the will before anyone else discovered its contents. Frederick muttered something to Constance about acting quickly before the lawyers began asking questions. And more than once, Hartwell caught veiled phrases. What must be done, certain arrangements spoken with urgency that had nothing to do with grief. Even the butler betrayed the strain. Wilhelm Krauss, so precise at the door, was now visibly unraveling. His hands shook as he tugged at the curtains, sweat standing out on his brow despite the February chill. "Forgive me," he stammered. "This has been a most difficult time. Mr. Pétion's passing was so sudden," Hartwell asked carefully when the patriarch had died. Krauss's eyes flicked toward the family before answering. "2 nights ago, sir. In his sleep. Very peaceful. Dr. Morrison said so, though." The hesitation was telling. He had complained of stomach pains after dinner. The explanation troubled Hartwell. Years of photographing the dead had taught him the subtle differences between peaceful passing and violent ends. Cornelius's expression, the stiffness of his limbs, even the faint chemical tang clinging to the air, they did not align with a quiet death in bed. As the daylight faded and the family finally relented, Hartwell withdrew to the pantry, converted into a makeshift darkroom, surrounded by the acrid scent of developer and fixer. Slipped the glass plates into their baths, his movements steady, ritualistic. Under the ruby glow, shapes slowly emerged from the chemical fog. First shadows, then lines, then faces like spirits surfacing from another world. The first batch contained the individual portraits. In Margaret's image, where she held her husband's hand, Hartwell noticed something unsettling. Cornelius's fingers were bent in a way no natural repose would allow, stiff and contorted, as though deliberately arranged. And on the back of his hand, faint but undeniable under the unforgiving eye of the camera, was a scratch too sharp, too precise to be dismissed as an accident. Under magnification, the thin, precise scratch read like a fingernail mark, the kind you get when someone yanks a hand away, and Hartwell judged it ante-mortem made while Cornelius was still alive and fighting. In Theodore's portrait, the jacket at the shoulder seam looked subtly pulled, and a dark stain bled into the collar near the neck, a pattern like dried blood that heavy makeup could not hide. Frederick's kneeling pose revealed still more, the mouth of the dead man, parted as if gasping, eyelids not fully closed. Tension set in the facial muscles and shadowing at the throat that suggested bruising hidden by the high collar. Most telling, the hands that seemed neatly folded in other angles were clenched hard knuckles fixed by rigor mortis. A defender's posture, not the calm of natural death. As Hartwell hung the plates to dry, he knew these signs did not match a peaceful passing. Scratches, torn fabric, a blood-stained collar. Terror stamped on the face. Fists locked to fight back together. They told the story of a violent end carefully staged as serenity. At dawn, fresh snow quieted Boston as he returned to his studio to study the images under strong light and a powerful magnifying glass. The evidence moved from suggestive to undeniable. The hands showed clear defensive wounds. Small cuts and crescent marks made in struggle, and the collar stain captured with merciless clarity by silver nitrate. Was blood hastily washed, but not erased? Hartwell did not need a laboratory to confirm what his trained eye already knew. The mark was unmistakable to a man who had once photographed crime scenes, the kind of bruising left only by strangling hands. And Constance's portrait, meant to show her grief, betrayed it all. As she bent to place the white rose, the collar of her father's burial shirt shifted just enough for the camera to catch what the eye had missed. Finger-shaped shadows beneath the makeup, the silent record of slow, deliberate suffocation. Cornelius Pétion had not died in peace. He had been executed face-to-face by someone he knew. Hartwell sat rigid in his chair, the plates spread before him like damning pieces of a puzzle. These were no memorial portraits. They were evidence of murder. The Pitons hadn't hired him to preserve their grief. They had unknowingly commissioned him to document their crime in detail, more precise than any witness could provide. And now, Hartwell was the only man alive who had seen it. The implications twisted in his gut. This was more than inheritance squabbles. The Piton fortune was large enough to sway Banks' elections and the very direction of the city. Murder money and influence wrapped together into a snare, and he had walked straight into it. He was still considering his next move when a sharp knock rattled the frosted glass of his studio door. A silhouette stood outside, a tall man in a fine overcoat, hat brim, low, a walking stick in hand. Hartwell opened the door to find Theodore Piton, his expression carefully composed. "Mr. Hartwell," he began with the smooth cadence of a man used to commanding a room, "I wanted to thank you personally for your sensitivity yesterday. It has been a difficult time." "Of course," Hartwell replied evenly, stepping back to let him in. As he did, his eyes flicked to the drawer where his revolver lay, hidden close enough to reach if the visit soured. Theodore's gaze swept the studio with quiet calculation. He noted the cameras, the drying plates, the locked cabinet where finished work was stored. His eyes lingered too long on the developing area, as if measuring what evidence already existed. Removing his gloves with deliberate care, he continued, "My family has been discussing the matter, and we've agreed we would prefer the photographs remain private. Family only, you understand. We are prepared to compensate you very generously for your discretion and for every plate, every negative, every copy you may have produced." The sum Theodore hinted at was more than Hartwell earned in months of steady work. Yet his manner was wrong, too casual for grief, too smooth for a simple transaction. Families sought memorial portraits to display, to show devotion. But here was the heir pressing to bury the evidence, not the father. And behind his polished courtesy, Hartwell could hear something else, the quiet edge of threat. "I appreciate your consideration," Hartwell said carefully, buying himself time while his mind turned over the danger he was now in. "But I keep copies of all my work for portfolio purposes. It's a standard practice. Clients often expect me to show samples of my memorial portraits." Theodore's expression hardened, the mask of grief slipping just enough to reveal calculation beneath. "That will not be acceptable, Mr. Hartwell. My family values privacy above all else. I'm sure you understand our position and can make an exception." The shift in tone was unmistakable. The request had become an order, the smooth cadence carrying weight far beyond polite society. This was no negotiation, it was an ultimatum issued by a man used to obedience. Hartwell nodded, keeping his voice measured. "Perhaps we could discuss the terms more specifically. There are professional considerations I must weigh along with the financial." He forced calm into his tone, though his thoughts darted to the drawer across the room where his revolver lay hidden. Theodore smiled thinly, but his eyes remained cold as they swept over the studio, lingering on the developing trays and the locked cabinet where Hartwell kept finished plates. He seemed to be taking stock as though cataloging evidence. "Of course." "Take your time," he said, tugging on his gloves again. "But understand time is limited. I will return tomorrow for your answer." He paused in the doorway, his voice dropping into the smooth cadence of a threat cloaked as courtesy. "My family holds considerable influence in Boston. We remember those who serve us well, and we have equally long memories for those who disappoint us." When the door closed, Hartwell locked it at once and pulled the curtains shrouding the room in the dim red glow of the dark room lamps. The photographs lay before him like evidence in a trial. Not keepsakes, not tributes, proof of murder etched forever in silver nitrate. The next day passed in dread. Hartwell could not concentrate on routine work. Instead, he buried himself in the photographs and in discreet inquiries about the Pitons. Rumors flowed easily in Boston's clubs and drawing rooms. Cornelius had quarreled bitterly with his heirs, had threatened changes to his will, had begun investigating irregularities in the family accounts. Theodore, entrusted with daily operations, had resisted his father's demands for transparency. Perhaps because exposure meant ruin, the motives were clear. The evidence in Hartwell's possession was undeniable. And the veiled threat delivered in his own studio left him with one conclusion: the Petons would kill to bury their secret. If he hesitated, if he failed to act, he would not live long enough to see those plates used for justice. Dawn broke gray and cold over Boston as Edgar Hartwell faced his choice. Fear and obligation pressed equally heavy upon him, but his decision was made. He would expose the Petons before they could silence him forever. Hartwell spent the gray hours before dawn working with meticulous care. He produced 6 complete sets of the most damning photographs, each print made on his finest paper, every shadow and line preserved in unforgiving detail. Like a man hiding treasure, he scattered them across the city, one sealed with his banker, to be opened only if he failed to return, another sent to his sister in Providence, along with a letter that laid out the truth and instructions to contact the authorities if silence stretched beyond a week. The originals he carried himself bound in a leather portfolio to the one place he both trusted and feared, the Boston Police Department. Detective Inspector Michael O'Brien had a reputation rare in the city's force, a Catholic officer respected for his honesty in a department long dominated by Protestant politics. When Hartwell appeared in his office, O'Brien assumed at first it was a case of insurance fraud or divorce routine work. But as the photographs were laid across his battered desk, the detective's expression hardened. Hartwell pointed out the details. Scratches etched into Cornelius's hands, finger-shaped bruises hidden beneath makeup, the torn fabric at the shoulder. The look of sheer terror frozen on the dead man's face. Under the magnifying glass, the evidence was irrefutable. "This is a grave accusation," O'Brien said slowly, his assistant scribbling notes as he examined each plate. "The Peton family's reach extends into every bank courtroom and backroom in Boston. If we pursue this, and you're mistaken, we won't survive the week." "I am not mistaken," Hartwell replied, his voice steady with conviction. "That man did not die peacefully. He was murdered in his own bed by the people who posed as mourners beside him. And the proof is here in silver and glass." O'Brien's instincts told him Hartwell was right. But years in the city's tangled politics had taught him caution. He promised to proceed discreetly to test the waters before committing to arrests. It was a prudent decision by any measure, but one that would prove fatal. By nightfall, word of Hartwell's visit had already reached Beacon Hill. The Petons' web of allies and informants stretched deep into the police department and the State House alike. Theodore's response was swift and merciless. He did not run, did not attempt to bury the evidence. Instead, he fell back on the family's truest legacy, decisive violence. That evening, as Hartwell made his way home from a late supper at a tavern near his studio, the snow-muted streets closed in around him. In the narrow darkness of an alley, 3 men emerged without a word, their movements deliberate, their orders unmistakable. The ambush came with ruthless precision, executed like a business deal. 2 men pinned Hartwell in the shadows, while the third stepped forward with a knife that caught the gaslight in a cold gleam. Hartwell's breath froze when he recognized the man. It was the same servant who had tried to force entry into his studio. The blade was no tool of quick death. Its long edge promised slow, deliberate pain, the kind of warning strike that would make others think twice about defying the Peton family. But Hartwell had not come unprepared. Since the failed intrusion the night before, he had carried a revolver close to his heart, a small Smith & Wesson compact, yet deadly, purchased in quiet confidence from a gunsmith who asked no questions. Summoning every ounce of desperation, he wrenched free of his captors with sudden violence and drew the pistol with a speed born of practiced caution. The alley exploded in chaos. Muzzle flashes strobed against brick walls, turning the night into a theater of violence. Shouts and curses echoed like cannon fire in the narrow space. When the gun smoke thinned and the ringing in Hartwell's ears began to fade, two of the attackers lay sprawled in spreading pools of blood, their stillness illuminated by the flickering gaslight. The third fled into the darkness, clutching a bloodied arm. Hartwell himself staggered, his shoulder torn by a knife slash, his body bruised but alive. The commotion brought residents to their windows. And within minutes, uniformed officers converged on the scene. Detective Inspector O'Brien himself took the statement, his face grave as he examined the corpses. Both dead men carried identification, tying them directly to the Piton household servants turned assassins, their loyalty purchased with gold and their silence guaranteed only by death. The failed execution attempt gave O'Brien the leverage he needed. By midnight, armed with warrants signed by one of the few judges untouched by Piton influence police, surrounded the Beacon Hill mansion. Lantern light glinted on rifles as they stormed inside. What they found confirmed everything Hartwell's photographs had revealed. Margaret Piton knelt before the fireplace in her husband's study, frantically feeding papers into the flames. Bank ledgers, letters from city officials, secret accounts, proof of bribery, fraud, and conspiracy curling into smoke as she wept through the task. Among them lay the most damning document of all, a written plan, detailing how Cornelius's body was to be prepared to mask any trace of foul play. Meanwhile, Theodore was caught at the servants' entrance, a leather satchel clutched in his hand. Inside were gold coins and bearer bonds, worth thousands of fortune portable enough to vanish across the sea. His capture marked the unraveling of the Piton dynasty, their empire of respectability collapsing in a single night of bloodfire and betrayal. The Pitons had been preparing for flight. Police discovered steamship tickets and travel documents in Theodore's satchel, evidence of a plan to flee first to New York, then across the Atlantic to Europe, where Boston's law could never reach them. They had intended to abandon their empire overnight, leaving only ashes and silence behind. Frederick and Constance were found cowering in the wine cellar, their composure gone. Frederick collapsed into sobs, while Constance remained eerily rigid, her stoicism a brittle mask. Among their belongings, police recovered Cornelius's original will, one that left the bulk of his estate to charities rather than his children. That document alone was enough to explain the family's desperate resolve. The arrests sent shockwaves through Boston's aristocracy. The Pitons had been untouchable for decades, their name a fixture in society columns and boardrooms. Now their downfall was front-page news from Beacon Hill to New York. Old whispers rose to the surface: embezzlement, fraud, the brutal exploitation of immigrants in mills and docks. The respectable facade crumbled, revealing rot at its core. The trial that followed was the most sensational Boston had ever seen. Crowds lined the courthouse steps. Correspondents poured in from New York, Philadelphia, even Chicago. At its center stood Edgar Hartwell's photographs, stark, merciless images that spoke more eloquently than any witness. Displayed on easels before the jury, they captured every detail. The bruises at Cornelius's throat, the scratches on his hands, the terror frozen in his face. They told the story of murder without words. The defense fought savagely, calling physicians to argue that the marks were natural, that rigor mortis and embalming could explain the twisted hands and strained features. But the tide turned with the revelation of bribery. Cornelius's own physician was forced to admit he had accepted $500 the day after the patriarch's death to falsify the certificate. And when Wilhelm Krauss, the family's butler, agreed to testify in exchange for immunity, the case became unassailable. In careful accented English, Krauss recounted the night of February 14th, 1887. The family had gathered for Cornelius's birthday dinner. Suspicious of missing funds, the old man had announced his intention to conduct a full audit of the accounts. More damning still, he revealed his plan to rewrite his will, cutting off any child found guilty of theft and leaving most of his fortune to charitable causes. That declaration sealed his fate. According to Krauss, the murder was a coordinated act. Each family member played a role not in passion, but in calculation. They subdued Cornelius as he left the dining room. Theodore's hands at his throat, while Frederick and Constance held him down. Margaret stood by giving instructions, her eyes fixed not on her husband's suffering, but on the fortune she intended to keep. The struggle was brutal, deliberate, and slow. Cornelius Peyton, one of the most powerful men in Massachusetts, died staring into the eyes of his own blood. Margaret's plan had been simple and cruel. The birthday cake she presented her husband was laced with arsenic enough to make Cornelius violently ill, but not instantly dead. The poison was meant to mimic natural sickness, a prelude to the story they would later tell. As the patriarch doubled over in agony, Theodore wrapped a silk necktie around his father's throat, tightening it with steady force, while Frederick and Constance pinned down his arms to prevent any struggle. Cornelius's death was long and terror-filled. He gasped and clawed at his children, eyes wide, with the dawning horror that the family he had built his empire to protect was murdering him for his wealth. The scratches on his hands testified to that desperate resistance, while the expression of terror captured forever in Hartwell's photographs preserved his final betrayal. The family's scheme relied on their privilege, a physician's certificate, a tale of peaceful death following a dinner complaint of stomach pains, a swift burial, and memorial portraits to display their grief. They believed their name would shield them from scrutiny. What they never anticipated was Edgar Hartwell. His trained eye, catching the signs of violence embalming, could not conceal, and his unwillingness to be silenced. The very technology they had employed to forge their innocence instead revealed their guilt in stark, unblinking detail. The verdict was swift. Margaret Theodore and Constance were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to hang. Frederick, whose role was limited to holding his father's arms, received life imprisonment with the possibility of parole. The Peyton fortune was seized by the state and eventually divided among charitable institutions, a bitter irony, given that Cornelius's original will had sought to leave much of his wealth to those same causes. On a gray October morning in 1888, the gallows claimed the three condemned Peytons. Margaret met death with grim dignity while Theodore and Constance faltered, requiring guards to steady them up the steps. Their execution marked the end of one of New England's most powerful families, a warning carved into history that neither fortune nor status could shield the guilty from justice. Hartwell survived, but he was not unchanged. He abandoned memorial portraiture forever, unable to look upon the dead without seeing the silent testimony of wounds and secrets. Instead, he turned his lens to landscapes and architecture, finding solace in subjects that could not lie. Detective Inspector Michael O'Brien, promoted to Chief of Detectives, often cited the Peyton case as proof of what modern investigation and the camera's cold eye could achieve when human testimony failed. The case became a milestone in American jurisprudence, one of the first to establish photography as admissible forensic evidence. The Peyton Mansion on Beacon Hill was sold at auction, its marble halls and silk-lined rooms, stripped of grandeur, converted into a boarding house for immigrants who arrived with nothing but hope. Where once Boston's elite plotted murder and betrayal, children now played in narrow hallways, their laughter echoing where whispers of conspiracy once reigned. And in Hartwell's studio, locked away in a drawer he never opened again, the original glass plates remained the silent, silver-lit witnesses to one of Boston's darkest crimes. Neighbors later claimed the old Peyton mansion carried a strange atmosphere. that unsettling sounds echoed through its halls at night. But whether those whispers were real or simply the echoes of its dark history, no one could say. By 1900, the building was gone, demolished, and replaced with modest housing, leaving no trace of the horrors once plotted inside its walls. As for Wilhelm Krauss, the butler whose testimony sealed the family's fate, he vanished after the trial. Some said he returned to Germany under a new name. Others whispered he died on the voyage home. His role in both the cover-up and the confession made him a pariah remembered as both betrayer and witness. The Piton case became a landmark in American legal history. Hartwell's photographs were among the first ever accepted as primary evidence in a murder trial, establishing forensic photography as a legitimate tool of justice. Across the country, police departments began adopting the practice, realizing that the camera's cold eye could preserve truths no witness could twist or deny. Edgar Hartwell lived until 1919, spending his later years capturing the landscapes and architecture of New England. His obituary noted his artistry, but mentioned only briefly the role he played in solving Boston's most infamous crime. He never married, perhaps unwilling to trust too deeply after witnessing the darkest betrayal a family could commit. His photographs of Cornelius Piton, donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society, remain preserved to this day, a chilling reminder that the camera does not lie. The Pitons believed their wealth would shield them. They believed appearances could protect them. But they underestimated two things: the unforgiving precision of the photographic lens and the courage of one man who refused to be silenced. So what do you think? Do you believe everything was uncovered about the Piton family's secrets? Or might there have been other victims of their greed, hidden beyond the reach of even Hartwell's camera? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story from America's darker past, don't forget to subscribe. Hit that notification bell and share this video with someone who loves historical mysteries. Until next time, remember, some secrets never stay buried.